And good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Talmud class. And this week we launch the first of the four-part series on Passover, on Pesach. And tonight I'm dedicating this class to talking about the thing concerning Pesach that's on everyone's mind over the next 3 weeks, and that is the Pesach blues. Forget about the chametz, getting rid of the chametz, we're not there yet. Let's not talk about the Pesach Seder, we're not there yet. What's on everyone's mind is, goodness gracious, I have to start cleaning this room, get this room done this week, get that room done next week, make sure everything's in place, start getting the supplies. Planning that week ahead where I'm going to have to get on all fours, or at least get someone else to get on all fours. Yeah. And that's what's really on everyone's mind now. That's what we're really getting into at this point. From the moment that Purim was over and we packed away the costumes or sold them on Amazon or whatever we did with them, and the moment that the last Hamantash was eaten or other things taken care of, and we started Pesach. So, that's going to be the topic of tonight. The topic of tonight is keeping focused on the concept of holiday joy. And when we focus on the fact of what it means to have Simchat Yom Tov, to have joy about the Yom Tov, about the upcoming holiday, with that perspective, over the next few weeks as we start getting ready for the holiday, hopefully you'll give a different meaning and a different walkaway as we prepare for the holiday Pesach over the next 3 weeks. Specifically, we're going to, since this is Talmud, it's a Talmud class on Pesach, we're going to focus the entire class on source number 1, which you have in front of you, a piece of Gemara in Tractate of Pesachim, that is the Tractate of Talmud talking about Pesach. It is a very, very thick tractate. I'm going to focus on Daf Kuf Tes, page 109, side A. And this little piece that we have in front of us in source number 1, the entire class is going to be based off this piece of Talmud. So let's begin. Tana Rabbanan, our sages taught, Chayiv Adam l'sameach banav uvnei veisei v'regel. A person is obligated to gladden his children and the members of his household on a festival. Now this is brought in Tractate Pesachim, talking about Pesach, Passover. And so the assumption over here is that we are also referring to Passover. And so, before we continue, let's talk about the emphasis of what we have in the Talmud. That we have an obligation to gladden the hearts of our children and the members of our household, that's including the wife, on a festival. Now, this does not negate the fact that we generally have this concept of being joyous. But what's interesting to note is that many people make the assumption that being besimcha, being joyous the entire year, is actually a biblical obligation. People may be aware of the phrase mitzvah gedola liyas besimcha tamid. It is a great mitzvah to be joyous tamid, constantly. The truth is that's not written anywhere in the Torah. It's not even mentioned anywhere in the Mishnah. It's a phrase, it's a saying from the books of Reb Nachman of Breslov. That's actually the origin of that phrase. But the truth is, it's actually not codified in any of the 613 commandments to be joyous the entire year. Now, that's not to say that the Torah does not say that we have this concept of being joyous, of being happy. Remember, there is a verse in the Torah that actually rebukes the Jewish people of not being besimcha. In one of the Teichacha, in the rebuke that we have, there's a verse that says, Tachat asher lo yavadeto et Hashem l'kecha b'simcha v'tul levav v'rav kol. For the fact being that you do not serve God b'simcha v'tul levav, with joy and with gladness of heart. And so what is it? So are we supposed to be b'simcha? Are we supposed to be happy the entire year or not? The truth of the matter is, it's explained in Tanya. Oh my goodness, we're inserting Chassidus into Talmud. But the truth is, I don't know if you guys realize, but I do that every single Talmud class. Because, come on, we're Chabad. There is absolutely no way I'm going to be giving a pure Talmud class without inserting something. The truth of the matter is, there is an entire chapter of Tanya written by the Alter Rebbe, dedicated to Simcha. Perek Chavav, chapter 26. Go read it. I encourage everyone to open it up and read it. It's in English as well. There's an entire chapter dedicated to Simcha, and over there the Alter Rebbe actually says very, very clearly that every single day of the year we need to be besimcha, we need to be happy. So why? Why isn't it so necessary? Yes?
Are there some days like Tisha B'Av where you're purposely not supposed to be happy?
Absolutely. There are some days that we are restrained from being happy. There are circumstances, for example, someone lost a loved one, where, especially within the first 24 hours or so until the actual funeral, they are in a status of aninus. They're called an onein, where they are not allowed to be besimcha. They're not even allowed to thank God for anything. That's why they don't even pray. They don't put on tefillin. They don't do anything. Then they are held back from even thanking God, showing gratitude. So we certainly have those moments where we are restrained. But in general, we are supposed to be serving God with joy and with gladness of heart. The Alter Rebbe explains over there. Alter Rebbe actually explains over there that being besimcha, it's not an end in and of itself. As we said before, it's not a mitzvah. It's the means to the end. The ultimate objective of all of us in this world is to serve God to the best of our capacity, to the best of our ability. Very, very often we look at this world and we have this perspective that, what does it mean to be happy? It means to win. Like we have this competitiveness. I see this person looks happy, and that person looks happy, this person has a lot of money, therefore he or she must be happy, and we try to emulate them, we try to compete with them, and we end up chasing our own tail. It's like a story. There were two people in Central Africa, and there's a lion they're in the middle of the Kruger National Park, and suddenly they realize they're being chased by a lion, and the lion's chasing them, and so the two men start running. They're running as fast as they can. They're running. The lion seems to be coming closer until one person turns to the other and says to him, what's the point of it here? You think we can outdo a lion? We're not going to outdo a lion. What's the point? Let's give up now. It's the other guy who's in the middle of running. He turns to the other guy and says, no, you don't get it. I'm just trying to outdo you. So we end up looking, the whole life is all about competition, and we look at this person, he looks happy, that person. We try, our definition of happiness is trying to compete and see how we can outdo somebody else. But says the Alter Rebbe, in a nutshell, just paraphrasing, the concept of simcha, of joy, it's not about competition. It's about understanding God doesn't want you to become a Moses, or doesn't want you to become a great tzaddik, a great scholar, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's not what we're here for. The idea is that we are serving God to the best of our capacity. And the only person that you are truly competing is yourself. You're not competing with anybody else. You're really competing with yourself. Am I doing the best that I can? And every day we should ask ourselves that question. Says the Alter Rebbe in chapter 26 of Tanya. How can you truly serve God to the best of your capacity? That's the ultimate objective of all of us being created on this earth. Serving God to the best of our capacity. How can we truly realize that? Says Alter Rebbe, only with simcha, only with joy. So joy, simcha, is a necessity to serving God ultimately to the best of our abilities, to the best of our capacities. So simcha, joy, is necessary on a daily basis as a means to an end, as a means to being able to serve God fully. Now, of course, what we say before, so God sets a benchmark for each and every one of us. And my benchmark is different than your benchmark, is different than his benchmark. Each one of us has that benchmark that we need to reach. There's another Talmud, it's a very famous Talmud. The Rebbe famously instituted 12 verses that he had every child say, and this comes from a Talmud. Yogati umatsasi tamin. If someone says, I tried hard and I did not succeed, you shouldn't believe him. This is Talmud, verbatim. If a person says, I did not try hard and I succeeded, we shouldn't believe him either. But if someone says, I tried hard and I succeeded, I'm loosely translating matsasi, and I found it, and I've achieved, tamin, you should believe. Now, what does it mean? What does that mean? Have you never saw someone that didn't try so hard and they succeeded? We've seen that. We've seen success. You saw someone trying their best and they just don't seem to get it. They're a shalom mazal. They're just not getting it. We see that too. So what does that Talmud mean? Well, the truth is we have to define properly what does it mean trying hard and what does it mean succeeding. And basically the point I'm bringing out before we get really into the Talmud is that we have to understand that when we do our part, we do the best of our capacity, and it's not just about the success. It's not just about the success. You may not see the entire picture of success. But in the meantime, during that process that you gave it your ultimate best, maybe that goal you did not reach, but you have achieved success in some way. Because if you truly tried hard, there is a little bit of success. There's a little bit of achievement. You moved up the ladder a little bit. You've achieved even the minutest things. And that itself, God is already considering as big success for you because you've reached your benchmark. Maybe that goal is not there yet. But the little successes that you have in your life, that benchmark that if you knew that you gave your ultimate best that day, for God, that's everything. That is your success. That is your success. Like we spoke about, we Farbrengen the line a few weeks back by Shabbos afternoon Farbrengen, that very often we mistakenly think that life, that success is all about achievements. You achieve it. Like what we spoke about a few weeks ago. A student, how do you define a good student? Only those that get A+. How do you define, only if you get to those universities, those colleges, prestigious places, those are considered la creme de la creme. But the truth is, what about all the other people? You could have a person that's received a D in class, but truly they deserve the certificate of everything, of achievement, because from them, their benchmark, they did the ultimate best. The other person who received 100, let's say, or a better example, someone else received 98 and didn't try very hard, you can't hardly call that success because they didn't try hard. If they truly tried hard, their benchmark is no less than 100. For the other person, their benchmark is 67. And so on and so forth. Okay. So we have this concept of being happy. Now comes Yom Tov, says the Talmud. It's an extra measure of being happy. Shenemar, how do we know that we need to be happy? As the verse says, "V'samachta bechagecha," that you shall rejoice in your festivals. B'ma mesamcham, with what will you rejoice? B'yayin, with wine. Now, what's interesting is that Tosfos over here actually comes across, and he asks a very important question. He says, "One second. This verse that is being brought about the idea of having joy on Yom Tov, on the festival, seems to be talking about something entirely different and not even referring to the festival in and of itself." To give a little bit of a background, there are 4 times in the Torah that the Torah says v'samachta, that there is the idea of being besimcha, to be of joy. There's a concept of Maaser Sheni. I'm going to speak about that in a second. There's a concept of bikurim. I'll speak about that as well. There's Shavuos, and then there's Sukkot. There's 2 festivals, Shavuos and Sukkot, that we have to be happy. And then there's Maaser Sheni, and then there's bikurim. What is Maaser Sheni? There's a concept of tithing. You give 10%, and you need to give 10%, etc., etc. And then on top, after you give the 10%, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, in the time of the temple, they had what was called a Maaser Sheni, a second tithing, based on the money that was left after you gave the 10% away. So it ends up being slightly less than 10%. You're not basing the 10% off your total income. It's a 10% after you've already given your 10% tax. 10% off that. This 10% is holy. Now, the truth is, every single time you give Maaser, I'm deviating a little bit. Every single time you give Maaser, you give 10% off. It's not that you're giving your own money. The Rabbi speaks about this all the time. God's lending you money on condition you give back. The truth is, what is that 10% that you're giving away? It's holiness. Your money that you made is holy. And you don't have permission to touch holiness. How do you access the holiness? That's your income. Holiness meaning the blessing that God gave you. You have to sanctify that bit of holiness that's been appropriated to you. And what is that holiness? That 10% that's supposed to be given as maser, as tithing towards charity. The same thing as Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithing that we're talking about. In and of itself was holiness. So how can it be sanctified and appropriated, this holy second tithing? The way it worked was that they brought it to Jerusalem, to Yerushalayim, and tithing, we're talking about produce, they would bring it over to the Holy Temple and they would eat it within the walls of Yerushalayim, of Jerusalem. That's Ma'aser Sheni. Then there's Bikurim, the first fruits. A farmer, their very first fruits, they would right away, they identify what was the first fruit, they would tie a red string around it, they would put it in a golden basket, or whatever basket they can afford, they travel to the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, and they sanctify it before God upon the steps of the Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. Over there also there's ultimate joy. But then there's Shavuos. Then there's Sukkos. These are the 2 times. Sukkos even mentions 3 times to be besimcha. Let's see it over here in source number 2, where it speaks about Shavuos. Source number 2, we see in Parshas Re'eh in Deuteronomy, V'asisa chag Shavuos Hashem Elokecha, you shall make a feast of Shavuos, of weeks for God. Second verse, that is verse 11 on the second line, V'samachta l'fnei Hashem Elokecha. This is actually the very first time that the Torah says about being besimcha, being joyous on any Yom Tov, on any festival. Who should be joyous? Ata, you, uvincha, your children, your sons, uvitecha, and your daughter, etc., etc. What about Sukkot? What about the holiday of Sukkot? This is source number 3, which is the top of the other side of the page. Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh lecha shivas yamim. You shall make the festival of Sukkos for 7 days. Verse number 14 on the second line, or in Hebrew in the top line, V'samachta b'chagecha. You shall be joyous in your festivals. Ato uvincha v'techa v'avdecha, you, your children, etc., etc. The end of the next verse, V'hayisa ach sameach. You shall have nothing but joy. And then there's a third verse elsewhere. So we have 3 times over Sukkot it speaks about being joyous. So says Tosfos, this verse that's referenced to us in the Talmud about being joyous was not even talking about festivals in the first place. It was talking about Ma'aser Sheni, second tithing. So why are we bringing it into the picture over here as having any connection to do with the festivals? This has nothing to do with the festivals. This was the Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithing that to be given. Now, to be honest, Tosfos actually had a different version of the Talmud, and he says, "V'samachta ata uveisecha." We read that the origin of being besimcha is from the 2 words "V'samachta b'chagecha." You need to be joyous on your festivals. Tosfos actually has a different version, "V'samachta ata uveisecha," different words, and he basically finishes off saying that the reason why the Talmud is bringing this verse is to tell us that the primary focus of our Talmud here tonight is about making your family rejoice for the festival. It's all about Beisecha, your household. Who has this obligation? The leader of the house. The leader of the house. So the focus here tonight, especially over here, I advertise Passover series for men. So what is the role of the man? Or if there's no men in the house, whoever is the leader of the house, what is the responsibilities? Besides for fixing the leak on the roof, besides for paying electricity bills, besides for doing all of those things, when it comes to time for Yom Tov, when it comes time for the festival, what are our responsibilities? To make sure that our household is happy, is besimcha. It's our responsibility, it's our duty. The leader of the house, it's our duty to do that. Now, B'mas continues the Talmud, back in source number 1. B'ma mesamcham, with what are we making them joyous? Bayayin, with wine. With wine. So, face value, being besimcha, being joyous on the festival is all about wine. The Talmud continues. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that's one opinion. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and he says, no, it's not just about wine. Anashim b'roi lahem. Men, whatever makes them happy. V'nashim b'roi lahen. Women, whatever makes them happy. It's not just wine. Whatever makes men happy, make men happy. Whatever is for women, you give for women. So Rabbi Yehuda continues and explains what makes men happy, what makes women happy. So he says, Anoshim b'rei lehen bayayin. Give a man a drink of wine or beer or something, and they're happy. Men are very, very low maintenance. Buy me a case of beer, I'm good.
Yeah.
Together with something else, together with something else to enjoy together with the beer, we're good. So bayayin, with wine. V'noshim b'mai. And with what do women, what is appropriate for women? Tani Rav Yosef b'Vavel, in Bavel, the big day tzivainin. So what do you do for the women? You send them off to Volusia Mall. You send them off to Tanger Outlets. What's that huge mall on the way to Orlando? The high-end mall. That place. If anyone knows what I'm talking about. There's a few. You send them shopping.
Yeah.
You send them shopping. That's... By the way, has anything changed in the last 2,500 years?
Credit cards, that's it.
It is a Pesach to remember. You
It's
can
a Pesach.
remember that bills for one.
You remember that. The Vav, there's a, it's reminding me also, there's a husband and wife, and the wife, a tzaddikas, very, very righteous wife, good, doing the right thing always. The husband, what a terrible, always negated whatever his wife was doing, was whining all the time. Never threw his socks in the laundry. Always left it on the floor. Shall I elaborate? I'm just saying what my wife tells me.
Yes.
So, and the wife, she's watching.
Yeah.
After 120 years,
Really be careful.
it happens to be that they pass away on the same day, that they go up to heaven. And the heavenly court turns to the wife and says, you know, you, clean sight, the entire lifetime, you were always doing the right thing. You were always so kind, always so generous, always so forgiving, always doing the right thing. We have a special place all the way up there for you. Then they turn to the husband and they say, we have a seventh chamber in Gehenna, in purgatory for you. So the wife says, standing there, the good wife that she was, turns to the heavenly court and says, you know, this husband, he's been with me all my life. I don't want to separate from him now. You know, don't separate us, please. So the angels are getting together and figuring, what do we do? You have to come up with a solution. We're going to put them together. She deserves all the way up there. He deserves all the way down here. So they came to a conclusion. They decided. The husband, it's been decided for you. So from now on, an eternal shopping spree with your wife. Okay. Wife, I hope I'm not that bad. Okay. Okay. So therefore he takes. So what does it mean? What's appropriate for men? Wine. What's appropriate for women? So says Rav Yosef. It's interesting, Rav Yosef, who tells us, we'll see what Rav Yosef says. He says, what's good for women? It depends on the fashion. It depends on the place where they are. Bevovel, the fashion in Babylon was bevigdei tzevain, in bright-colored garments. That was the fashion in Babel. Be'eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, bevigdei pishtan, with cotton or flax clothing, meguhatzin, ironed, pressed. That was the fashion in the land of Israel. It's interesting, by the way, Rav Yosef was blind. No, he was the rabbi. It tells elsewhere, I think in the end of Tractate Shabbos, it talks about Rav Yosef. He was blind. So it's interesting that he's the one that's telling us about the difference between women's fashion in the land of Babylon and in the land of Israel. It just comes to show you the rabbis are not just coming and giving layman terms. Everything is divine. It's interesting. So that's the way it works. You make the man happy with wine, the woman, you have to make them happy. And what did we say? Chai, if you're obligated. This is the obligation. Obligation to make the wife happy, take her shopping. Women, you want to make the husband happy, give him a beer. Pesach, give him wine. Fine, wine. Everyone's going to get a chance with wine. So So there's a husband and wife shopping in Volusia Mall. No, another place. They're shopping somewhere else. And suddenly the husband disappears for a while. The wife's looking, where did he go? She gets a phone call. Hello? Hi, darling, where are you? I'm here. Oh, where are you? You know where I am? You know that jewelry store that we were by? Yes. Remember that corner over there with those shiny rings? The shiny diamond rings, those wedding rings? Yeah? Remember that $15,000 diamond ring right there in the corner that we really, really wanted? Yes. And the wife is getting all teary-eyed. Yeah. The husband says, I'm right next door in the sports bar. Rabbi said that one before?
Yeah.
Oldie, but Goldie. Okay. Continues the Talmud. Tanya Rabbi Huda ben Meseira. Rabbi Huda ben Meseira says, Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, in the days when the holy temple still stood, ein simcha el bebasar. True joy was only achieved with meat. With meat. Shene'emar, what type of meat? Shene'emar, the verse says, V'zavachta shlomim v'achalta sham. How were they rejoicing with meat? Because they were sacrificing the carbon shlomim, a special shlomim sacrifice. V'achalta sham v'samachta l'fnei Hashem l'ikecha. They would eat it there in Jerusalem, in the holy temple, and they would rejoice before their God. But now she'ein beis hamikdash kayam, now that the holy temple doesn't stand, and we don't have these sacrifices, ein simcha el beyayin. Nowadays we only have joy with wine. With wine. Shene'emar, as the verse says, v'yayin yisamach levav enosh, and wine gladdens the heart of man. A clear verse. This is in chapter, I believe, Kuf Daled 104 in Psalms. Every Rosh Chodesh, actually, in the beginning of each month, there's a gray box that we say prior to the reading of the Torah in our Siddur, and it's actually this verse is actually mentioned in that part that we in that insert. So v'yayin samach levav. So we have this obligation to have wine. That's the opinion of Rabbi Huda ben Beseira. So basically we have three opinions. Tana Kama, the first rabbi of the Talmud, the opinion over here, says that how can you gladden your family with wine? Says Rabbi Yehuda, no, not necessarily with wine. Men, you give wine. Women, you give them clothing, or haroy lahem, he calls it clothing. And says Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira, really the main part of Simcha joy is meat, but now that we don't have the Holy Temple partaking of meat, so now we fulfill it with wine. Now we fulfill it with wine. So now, the truth is, so that's the Talmud we're going to focus on for the remainder of tonight's class. And the question that we have is, the entire flow of this piece doesn't really make sense. And let's elaborate and explain why. At first, we ask ourselves that everyone is obligated to rejoice in the festival. And how do we rejoice? With wine. And look at the wording. How do you cause your house, besamcham, them? How do you make them joyous? How do you make your household joyous? Now remember, we said, Ata, uvincha, uvitecha, uvesecha, you, your sons, your daughters, your household. How do you make them happy? Bayayin, with wine. What's going on over here? Make them happy with wine? I'm about to give my kids wine. What's going on here? How does that make sense? Well, what does that mean? And then we say another opinion. No. Men, you give wine. Women, you give what they want. Comes Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira and says, really, today it's wine. Is he arguing? Is he agreeing? The whole flow doesn't really make sense. So is the simcha, is the joy about drinking wine? Is it about eating meat? I mean, eating meat only back then? What about today? One or the other? Are they even arguing? They're just saying different statements. Not necessarily are they arguing. It could be that the Tanna Kama, the first opinion of the Talmud, maybe he was talking about only men. And he was agreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, the second opinion, who says, men, you give wine. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira also is not arguing with that, because he says that since we don't have the Holy Temple, we have joy with wine. So they're all saying the same thing. There's no argument here. So the flow doesn't add up. What's even more disturbing is source number 4, where the Rambam, Maimonides, codifies it into Jewish law. And we're going to skip for a second the first line, and we speak about the menfolk, or in the second line, V'ha anashim. V'ha anashim eichlin, men, what do we eat? What do we do to rejoice on the festival? Eichlin basar v'shaisin yayin. She'ein simcha el b'basar ve'ein simcha el b'yayin. Maimonides actually says that we eat meat and we drink wine, because there's no joy like eating meat and there's no joy like drinking wine. 1 second. Where did Maimonides get that from? In the Talmud it didn't say that you eat meat and drink wine. If anything, it says to just drink wine. Where is the source for the Rambam, the Maimonides, to say that you have to eat meat? True, it was in the Holy Temple, but is that applicable today? Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira just told us it's not, because we don't have the sacrifices. Now let's delve into that for a moment. What does it mean that they had joy? That they had joy when they ate meat? We have to understand what's going on over here. The truth is, the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who lived in the 15th, 16th century, is famously known for authoring the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. He actually asks this question. He asks this question on the Rambam, on Maimonides. Where is your source to say that in order to fulfill the Simcha we have to eat meat? Where's your source? So therefore, the piece of the Rambam actually makes it even more difficult to understand this Talmud. So you have to understand the flow. And we need to understand where Maimonides got this concept from, because the Talmud didn't say anything about eating meat and drinking wine. So where is this obligation? And what is the obligation of being happy? Okay. So I'm going to introduce to you a Marshal, Yam Shel Shlomo. This Yam Shel Shlomo gives us a little insight as to the key factor of what it means to be besimcha, to be joyous nowadays. The Yam Shel Shlomo says, let me offer an explanation as to why the Rambam, despite the fact that the Talmud did not tell us that we need to eat meat and drink wine, why did the Rambam codify it as such? That we need to eat meat and drink wine, and both of them are necessary. And so he comes along and he explains as follows. He says, first of all, we have to understand, what did it mean to be happy in the times of the Holy Temple, the Beis HaMikdash? What did it mean? He explained. Here's how it works. A person would wanted to be happy. How did they bring happy? They offered an animal to the Beis HaMikdash, a carbon shlamim. They would come to the Beis HaMikdash. They would offer that sacrifice. The sacrifice is brought up on the altar. The person who gave the animal, donated the animal, partakes in eating the meat. And so they experience the ultimate joy. Doesn't mean that they never said Kiddush. They never made Kiddush. It doesn't mean that they never drank wine in those days. But the wine wasn't necessary. The person experienced ultimate joy. You didn't even have to explain why he was joyous. It's like a person who won the lottery. Then are they drunk? They're not drunk. But you can see that, all the excitement of being happy. You may ask them, are you drunk? I'm not me drunk. I'm not drunk. So why are you so happy? Why are you jumping around like a maniac? You want to know? I can explain it to you. The lottery just went up to 750 million. Yeah?
Yeah.
Who's counting? So I'm full of joy. I'm full of joy. I can explain it to you. You know, so they had wine back then. There's the concept of drinking wine. However, they didn't need the wine. They didn't need it to be besimcha, to be happy. They already experienced it. So eating the meat was only expressing in some way, but the truth is that they didn't need it. They were completely enwrapped in the ultimate joy of the festival when they partook in that sacrifice. Explains the Yam Shel Shlomo, that is different nowadays because we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, what do we have today? We have wine. However, wine, that's what the Talmud tells us. But now we're in Galus, we're in exile. And wine itself is not necessarily sufficient enough. Because we're on a lower level, we've been in exile for a very long time, we don't have the Holy Temple. And so therefore we need much more of an assistance. And so therefore, says the Yam Shel Shlomo, this is what the Rambam means when he says, it's not enough nowadays to just have wine, it's necessary to have meat as well. Even though the primary source of joy nowadays is not the meat, because we are not offering any sacrifices, the primary source of joy nowadays is the wine. But because in the times of the Holy Temple we did have festivities based on the meat, therefore we need the meat nowadays as an assistance to the wine, albeit being second place, but still we need the assistance of both wine and meat to experience that same joy. Although one can still achieve being full of joy even without the meat and the wine. The Baal Shem Tov illustrates this beautifully. He gives an analogy of what does it mean when we drink wine on Yom Tov. What does it mean? He explains as follows, and I'm choosing this analogy of the Baal Shem Tov deliberately for a reason. We will, as we wrap up the class at the end, we will discuss the point I'm driving at. The analogy of drinking wine on Yom Tov. There was a king, and the king had a son, a prince, a crown prince. He knew that his son would one day become king. And he felt that his son needed the proper education. Because after all, the son is growing up in the palace, an elitist, enjoying the pleasures and royalty of the palace. And therefore the son would never have true empathy for the town folk, for the country folk living in the kingdom. So the king made a very, very harsh but just choice in kidnapping, without him telling his son, having people grab his son in the middle of the night and threw him out of the palace into a very run-down little town out in the outskirts. Pulled the sack off the head, ran away. And the son was there. Suddenly he was in the palace, now he's suddenly there needing to fend for himself. It was very, very harsh in the first week or two. Very, very harsh. But slowly, in survival mode, the prince slowly became accustomed in figuring out how to survive. And after a long time, got very, very used to the little town he was in, grew out of it, and moved into the countryside and really became full-fledged country boy. After a very long time, after a while, the king, who was monitoring his son from a distance after a long time, felt, okay, it's been a long time. I feel that my son has truly experienced what it means to be a regular person. It's time to bring him home. It's time. My son has had the proper education. It's time to bring him back home. And so the king sends a royal messenger with a royal message, with the royal seal, sends it to the son. The message is delivered. Son, I'm your father. I'm your father, the king. I haven't forgotten about you. It's time to bring you home. Come back home. Here's a big bag of gold. Get yourself together. Get yourself ready. You are the prince after all. And come back home. The son did not forget about the palace either. Was very rejoiced. Very, very happy. So happy. But how is he going to share his happiness? Of course, he's very excited to go home. But his neighbors, his friends, and everybody in the town, in the little village in the countryside, then they're going to look at him, they're going to believe him that he's a prince. They never believed him. At first, the first day, he tried telling everybody, I'm the prince, I'm the prince. They looked at him like he was a maniac. He's not going to tell everybody. How is he going to convince everybody he's a prince? So he came up with an idea. He told all the country folk, come with me to the tavern. Come to the tavern. He had a lot of gold. He turned to the innkeeper and he says, everyone drinks on me. Everybody. Threw gold on the table. Drinks on me, everybody. Oh, now drinks doesn't just mean a Bloody Mary or a pina colada. Drinks, heavy duty, 96% proof alcohol. Drinks on everybody. They had one shot. Another round of drinks. Another round of drinks. And before you know it, everyone is very happy. Everyone's singing and dancing. Why was everyone singing and dancing? Because they got a lot of alcohol. And why? And in the meantime, the prince was also singing and dancing. But why was the prince singing and dancing? Because he was about to go home to the palace. So everyone was dancing and singing together with him. Everyone else was dancing and singing because they're having a good time. They're having their booze. And the prince is rejoicing in the meantime, knowing in his heart and his mind he is going home. Says the Baal Shem Tov that this is a good analogy, euphorism. This is an analogy in explaining drinking wine on Yom Tov, on the festival. That we go about our daily lives, our day-to-day, and we are experiencing the experience of working and trying to earn a living just like everybody else. Then it comes Yom Tov. We get that message from God. I'm your father. Time to come home a little bit. Come to experience the bond with me. So our neshama, our soul, begins rejoicing. Here's our opportunity. Then comes our body. Then comes our nefesh haba, our animal soul, and tells us, what are you getting all excited about? You maniac. You maniac. What are you getting all excited about? So what do? How do we convince the animal soul to be happy? So you give him some l'chaim. You give him some flesh. Well, no one here knows what flesh is.
Meat.
Yeah. You give him some meat. You give him some meat. Animal soul. You make him happy. And in the meantime, the animal soul says, l'chaim, give me another one. Meat, a good meal. Oh, bring it on. Let me stuff my face. So everyone is happy. The animal soul is happy because it's getting its wine, it's getting its meat. And the neshama is being happy because we're having this opportunity of returning to our Father, returning to the King, experiencing a Yom Tov in its truest form. So this is all in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. That the true joy was felt when we partook in a karban. You eat the meat. The meat was only an expression of the feeling that you're rejoicing in the mitzvah, in connecting with God. The meat was only there to help. Nowadays we need the wine and the meat together. This is the Yam Shel Shalom explaining this. The Yam Shel Shalom actually finishes off and he says, this is helping us understanding the Rambam. Helping us understand the Rambam and also understanding perhaps what it means when the Talmud is saying Mesamcham b'yayin, rejoicing with wine. Truthfully, Tosfos himself actually says, Hein b'ma besamcha b'yayin. Tosfos actually says, when we say in the Talmud you should rejoice over wine, says the Tosfos, word for word, Hainu b'zman hazeh, that's today. Today is wine. Aval b'zman Beis HaMikdash, in the times of Beis HaMikdash, ein simcha el b'basar. Joy was only experienced with meat. And now we understand, based on the Rambam, and as is explained by the Yam Shel Shlomo, today we need both. We have wine and we have meat. And both of them are necessary, as we said before, to basically make it ourselves rejoice. To make ourselves rejoice. And therefore, and makes our neshama in the meantime is rejoicing as well. Jumping a little bit back to source number 4. This is deviating a little bit to what we our point in tonight's class, but it's still the same Rambam, and therefore it's still very, very important. Says the Rambam. I want to point this out, even though it's deviating a little bit. Says the Rambam, line number 3, at the last word in the English, and the last word in line number 3. In the Hebrew, at the beginning of line number 3. That when a person eats and drinks on Yom Tov, they are obligated to feed the ger, the yosem almana, the stranger, the orphan, the widow, together with all the other poor unfortunates. Someone who locks the doors of his courtyard. Harsh. Someone who locks the doors of his courtyard. Someone who eats and drinks with just him and his family, and does not feed and give to drink those who are more unfortunate. Ein zu simchas mitzvah. This is not considered the joy of mitzvah. Ella simchas kreisei. Nothing more than the joy of indulging celebrating his own stomach. Just pulling it out there. So, by the way, this is also the reason why simcha, what's the difference between simcha and oneg? Simcha means joy, oneg means pleasure. On Shabbos, we experience v'karasa l'Shabbos oneg. We call Shabbos, we call oneg pleasure. On Yom Tov, we have the special concept of simcha, of joy. What's the difference between simcha and oneg? Simcha and pleasure, joy and pleasure. The difference is, and now you'll understand what's the difference between the Shabbos and the Yom Tov. By Shabbos, we have the concept of pleasure. What's pleasure? Pleasure is rest. A person can experience pleasure by themselves. You kick your shoes off, you sit on the couch. You can experience true pleasure. Enjoy, have a good meal, etc., etc. True pleasure comes for Karasal Shabbos Oneg. Why? Because Shena b'Shabbat Tanug, Oneg. Pleasure comes from Shena, from rest, from sleep, from rest. Simcha, joy, is a little different. Because Simcha, joy, a person cannot experience true joy unless they share it with somebody else. So therefore, that is why, more than Shabbos, there's actually an obligation that Simcha, joy, must be shared with other people. And that's truly the Chabad approach, which is why every single time that there's a Jewish holiday or an important day, we always make sure to share it with other people. Purim, it's not about just getting yourself drunk. It's about going out there, bringing Shachmanas to other people, going all over town, making sure that everyone hears the Megillah, going and reading Megillah out in the streets. Pesach, making a communal Seder. I'm not just sitting on my dining room table at home. I'm making sure I'm inviting guests. Sukkah, we make a grand sukkah, making sure inviting people in. It's not just about being nice. That is Simcha. That's the true Simcha of Yom Tov, as the Rambam codifies it. Finishing off.
9.
9. Okay. Alright. I started at 8:10. Okay, so we'll start wrapping this up. I want to ask you a question. Look at source number 2 and number 3. What 2 festivals did we mention about Simcha, about joy? First, we talked about Shavuos. That's the first time Simcha is mentioned. And then we talk about the holiday of Sukkot, Sukkos. In fact, Sukkot mentions Simcha, joy, 3 times. Then we talked about Bikurim, the first fruits, and we talked about Ma'aseh Sheni, the second tithing. What's missing? Which important festival is missing that the Torah does not mention about Simcha, joy? Pesach. Hello. Tractate Pesachim, the Talmud on Pesach. We're talking about joy here. This is Passover series. Where's Simcha mentioned about Pesach? Maybe we're supposed to be having Pesach blues. Maybe that's the whole point. What happened to Simcha on Pesach? Well, pleasure. We should have pleasure. Yeah, you go ahead and have pleasure eating a cracker.
It's more like a remembrance holiday. It's not a joyful jumping around and dancing, right?
Truth is, you don't. You know why no one's jumping around and rejoicing? Because everyone has a stomachache. So what happened to Pesach? So on that, I'm not going to open a book. On that, I'm going to open up a Tosfos in Chagiga. There's a Tosfos, a very famous Tosfos in Chagiga, that asks this question: is there a concept of being joyous on Pesach? Because after all, the Torah does not spell it out clearly that there's a concept of being joyous on Pesach. We only see it by the other two regalim, the other two festivals, Shavuos and Sukkot. So, there's a Tosfos in Chagiga that tells us as follows. It says, the Torah makes a hekesh. A hekesh means we liken one thing to a next. Now, the fact that the Torah in Parshas Re'eh and in the Torah portion of Emor puts the holidays of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot all together, and we speak about joy on Shavuos and on Sukkot. So because Pesach is mentioned there as well, we make a hekesh. We say, since Pesach has been inserted there, it means that we have to liken one to the other. Just like on Shavuos we have joy, just like on Sukkot we have joy, we're supposed to be having joy on Pesach as well. That is the Tosfos in Chagiga. Now, the Sefer Yereim, that's another commentary, holy commentary, actually gives us two different insights, two different interpretations, and what it means to have joy on Pesach, on Passover. He says two things. First of all, there is a Torah methodology called Gezerah Shava. Gezerah Shava, it's one of the 13 ways of the way we deduce from the Torah. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, we say in the morning, the Shlosh Esrei Midas HaTorah Nedrash is 13 different formulas, the way we deduce from the Torah. One of them, this Kal V'chomer, the second one is Gezerah Shava. What is a Gezerah Shava? We take two identical words or two identical phrases in the Torah, and we say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. It says there are certain rules applying to this phrase, and we say because there's an identical wording in a different place in the Torah, they have the identical rules. By Pesach it says, B'chamisha Asar Yom, on the 15th day, Pesach LaHashem. It's Pesach L'Vad. By Sukkot it says, B'chamisha Asar Yom, it also says on the 5th day, Chag HaSukkos Tasel Chashavas Yomim, you shall make for yourself the whole festival of Sukkot for 7 days. What does it mean, making a festival for Sukkot 7 days? For those who were with me, Tractate Sukkah, last year we were talking about that, you could tell me all about it. But we had the concept of 15 and 15, B'chamisha Asar Yom, 15th day. So the Sefer Yereim says, just like on the 15th day of Sukkot, we have the concept of Simcha. So the Torah makes a Gezerah Shava and says that phrase 15th day is the same with Pesach, so we apply it as well. Then the Sefer Yereim goes even further and says, what's interesting is that the Torah says, Shalosh Regalim Tachaygu. Tachaygu. Shalosh Regalim, the three Regalim, literally means feet. The three festivals, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, are considered the three regalim, the 3 feet. Why? Because those are the 3 times that the Jews made pilgrimage, that they went up to the Holy Temple, they traveled to Jerusalem, to the Holy Temple. What does it say about those 3 festivals? Tachaygu. You shall be festive. You shall be festive. And what did we say in that verse that we had in source number 1? V'samachta bechagecha. You need to be joyous in your chagim, in your festivals, the same word. So it says the Sefer Yereim, even though true, it doesn't say Simcha on Pesach. But because we call it Chag HaPesach, it's the festival of Pesach, it's one of the chagim, it's one of the Shalosh Regalim, it's one of those 3 festivals that we make pilgrimage to the Holy Temple, so the rules still apply in it as well. Skipping forward. Okay. Because now I have 5 minutes left. So let me bring to you what the Alter Rebbe says. Rav Shlomo Zalman Liyadi in Shulchan Aruch Harav, how he puts this all together in being besimcha. He says as follows, this is Siman Tavkuf Chavtes, I believe that's 529. Yep, 500, chapter 529, and this is Halacha Zayin. Keitzad mesamchen, how do you experience the simcha, the joy of Yom Tov? Hakatanim, the young ones, noisen lahem, klois vegoizim. You give them candy. You make whatever that makes them happy. Hanashim, koinu lahem begadim v'tachshitin. The women, you send them to Nordstrom. You send them to JCPenney, to Dillard's, to Macy's, to all those wonderful places, and give them the credit card that will bounce. I'm just kidding. You make them happy. V'anashim, and the men, Bizman shebeis hamikdash hayikayim. In the time when the Holy Temple stood, hayechlum basar shlamim l'simcha. They used to eat the meat of the carbon, of the sacrifices. Achshav she'ein beis hamikdash kayim. Now that the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, is not standing, ein yotzim midei chayv simcha ela beyayin. We fulfill our obligation with wine. Shenemar v'yayin yisamach levavenosh. Wine gladdens the heart of man. Aval basar, but with meat, ein chayv alechol achshav. There's no true obligation to eat meat nowadays. Kivin she'ein lanu basar shlamim, because we don't have that sacrifice, the carbon shlamim. But says Alter Rebbe, kol makayim, but nevertheless, mitzvah yesh b'achilas basar b'yom tov. We anyways have an obligation to eat meat on the festival. Kivan shenemar by simcha, because it actually says about meat that there is joy in it as well. The hoil vein ef shalanu l'smayach by beikar simcha shu achilas basar shlamim yishanu l'samcha b'shak kol minei smachos. Says Alter Rebbe, which basically goes hand in hand with the Yam Shel Shlomo, and I'm going to insert this anyways, even though we're short in time. The Shagas Aryeh, which is a very, very famous for those who study Talmud a lot. It's a very famous commentary. The Shagas Aryeh actually says, give a true understanding of all of this. The Shagas Aryeh says, the whole idea of having joy on Yom Tov has nothing to do with the wine, has nothing to do with the food, the meat. It's all about your neshama. It's all about your soul being joyous on the festivals. In fact, that is a mitzvah from the Torah that's applied nowadays. Even though we don't have the Holy Temple, we still have to do our utmost, our best to rejoice on the festival of Yom Tov. The wine and the meat is only a means. The best way to experience that in the Holy Temple was with the meat. Nowadays, the best way to appreciate that is with the wine. But the main point is not you drink wine, therefore you will be happy. You eat meat, therefore you'll be happy. We need to be happy. And the best way that we can get assistance for that is the wine and the meat. What's the point the Shagas Aryeh is saying? He's driving to, the point he's bringing out is, the meat and the wine is only a euphemism. When we say wine, we don't mean wine. When we say meat, we don't mean meat. Obviously, if wine makes you simcha, you drink wine. If meat makes you simcha, makes you joyous, you eat meat. What if someone doesn't like meat? Says the Shagas Aryeh, that's the point. The whole idea is simchat Yom Tov, the joy of Yom Tov. If chicken makes you happy, then you eat the chicken. If you are a vegan, eat the Impossible Burger without the bun, because it's Passover. If that is your simcha, that is your simcha. Don't drink beer, that's chametz. Have some arak. Yeah, that's kosher for Pesach, by the way. That's it. So therefore, it's all about the main joy. So says the Alter Rebbe that point as well. What is the point of being b'simcha today, being joyous? With any type of simcha, there's a point of being joyous with any type of joy that will gladden your heart. Lakach, therefore, that's why we have a bigger meal on Yom Tov than we have on a regular Shabbos. With Shabbos, it doesn't even say the term simcha. It doesn't even say the word simcha, joy, when it comes to Shabbos. As we said before, it says oneg. That's why there's a concept that we even have nicer looking clothing on Yom Tov than we have on Shabbos, which is why that's the origin of the custom based on this halacha. This is a law. That's why we have that custom to buy new clothing not on the regular Shabbos. We save for Yom Tov. When it comes Yom Tov time, we buy a little piece of jewelry for the wife. We buy a nice shirt or something. We order on Amazon because we're not interested in shopping. We get something for ourselves for Yom Tov as well. There is a concept of that. I want to finish off with this point, which culminates everything that was spoken about. But why doesn't it say Simcha about Pesach? There's that nagging question which still hasn't really been answered. We said it's juxtaposed, there's hekesh, we liken one to another, we draw comparisons, and then therefore we basically deduce that you be joyous on Pesach. Why doesn't it say Simcha about Pesach in the Torah? Why is it so roundabout? Comes the Yalkut Shimoni. Yalkut Shimoni is a medrash, and in Parshas Emor. Parshas Emor is the first time in the Torah that we talk about the three festivals. The Yalkut Shimoni asks this question: why isn't Simcha joy mentioned when it comes to Pesach? And he says as follows. He says we have to understand Chag HaPesach is the time of planting the seeds. So the person, he's experiencing some sort of joy because he's planting seeds in the ground. However, that person is not fully joyous because they don't see that it's not yielding results yet. They are worried. What about the winter time? What about is there going to be a hurricane season? Is there going to be a harsh season? Is my crop going to die? Is it going to rot? Is it going to be diseased? Etc., etc. Doesn't see it yet. Then comes Shavuos. Shavuos is the first time that we have Simcha. Why? Because it's harvest, Chag HaKatzir. It's the harvest season. We see the results. We're starting to cut it. But when do we experience true joy? The holiday of Sukkot. That's why we mentioned Simcha joy 3 times, because that's called Chag HaAsif. That's the festival of gathering in. Now we're gathering all of our food into the silos. We are bringing in all the money into the bank. Now we got dengi. Now we're fully joyous because we see the profits. Now we're enjoying the profits. So the Rebbe in the Sikha, I don't have the Sikha from me, but I read it before. And with this we end. The Rebbe in the Sikha asks a very fundamental question. Torah is eternal. Everything in Torah has a life lesson for us. What can we possibly learn from the Yalkut Shimoni that the reason why there's no Simcha on Pesach is because 2,000 years ago, a farmer wouldn't see results when they're planting seeds. Some Jews are farmers out there today, but me, you, and the guy across the street, we're not farming anything. Maybe in the backyard we have a garden, but when this is not our living, we're not making an income out of this. So how do we apply that? What's the application? How does that talk to me? Fundamental question. So the Rebbe says that's also an analogy. We have to understand it's also a euphemism. Because the planting of the seeds, the 3 festivals actually represents 3 different types of Jews, 3 levels. Chag HaPesach, we have to understand, Passover is all about the time that we left Egypt. We left Egypt, we were just freed from slavery, we just were born as a nation. But did we understand what it meant to be Jewish? Besides for the 3 things of not changing our clothing, not changing our language, preserving family purity, etc., etc. Besides for that, we didn't know what it meant to have a relationship with God. We were slaves for 210 years, 86 years of backbreaking labor. We didn't know what it meant to be serving God, having a relationship with God. And so therefore the Jewish people from day one, they were complaining, they were kvetching. And that still goes till today. We're whining and complaining every step of the way. So we didn't experience true freedom yet and a true bonding with God. Comes a second holiday, Shavuos, the giving of the Torah. Lightning, thunder, it was happening. The biggest revelation of all of time that's still till today. The revelation of God in Mount Sinai. We received the Torah. We were given its laws. Now we're on a higher level. We're more joyous. Did we have a chance of experiencing simcha, of joy yet? Did we have a chance of practicing those laws yet? No. In fact, 40 days later, we slipped up with the golden calf. We made a huge mistake. But what happened after that? We did teshuvah. We returned. We were on that level of tzaddik when it came to the giving of the Torah. And after that, we experienced the level of a Baal teshuvah. We did teshuvah. We repented. And it comes after the repentance, and God forgave us. And now we get to practice. Now we truly appreciate what it means a relationship with God. Wow, the God who gave me the Torah. I am Mr. Imperfect. I slip up. In fact, I do a golden calf. God is still forgiving me. He's telling me, come back home. I'm your father. Come back home. That's ultimate joy. I have a father. I have a God who's watching over me, who is so forgiving. I can slip up. I can mess up that bad. And he still wants me. He still is interested in me. He says, come back home. Build a relationship with me. That's the ultimate joy. And to illustrate this as a mashal, an analogy, a king, this is my last analogy of the night, a king gives his daughter over to somebody to get married. And this new groom, back in the day, in the religious world, we experienced this a little bit. In the non-religious world, getting married means that they spent 6 years together or living already, and after this is their sixth marriage, and they're getting married 6 times already, and then they get them together. I said that very extreme. In the religious world, similar to the way it was in the royalties. There was courting. They didn't spend 6 years together. They met each other. It was decided. There was a match made. They went out 2 or 3 times, and then after that, they get married. So not necessarily did the groom fully appreciate who he married. He didn't appreciate it. I mean, he was happy to be married to her, but he didn't appreciate her for who she really was. Only after a few months of living with her, after 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, after that amount of time, the groom was truly happy. Why? Because after living with her, he was able to see just how lucky of a man he really is. He says, wow, I was, until now, the marriage was a marriage. We were getting married. But now after 7 months or so, now I appreciate her for who she really is. And now I really understand just how lucky of a person I am that I'm married to her. This is ultimate joy. Ultimate joy. It's the same thing with Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Pesach, of course we are happy. But we're in the beginning stages. We're still learning. We're still experiencing. We're still building clean slate, building a new relationship with God. So our takeaway. What's our takeaway? Our takeaway is one needs to be happy. One needs to do what we got to do. We got to make sure that we have a case of wine ready for Passover. We should try to have meat or the best delicacies on the table. But the point of Simcha, of joy in Yom Tov, is, if there's one thing that we can learn from that Sikh of the Rebbe, it's that true joy on the festival is beyond the meat, it's beyond the wine. It's like what the Shagas Aryeh says, it's all about joy of the neshama. That's what it's really all about. And when we have that proper perspective and realizing Yom Tov is coming up, what does that mean? That's my opportunity to rebuild a bond, a relationship with God, with Hashem, to move past, to satisfy the animal soul so that my neshama, so that my soul can rejoice that's coming home. What more can we look forward to? What better thing is there to look forward to? The opportunity for our neshama to return back to Hashem in a festive way, to return home and gladden our hearts and our family. Now we understand the Talmud. When the Talmud says "Mesamcham b'yayin," make them happy with wine, it doesn't mean giving our kids wine. It means giving them the concept of wine, a euphorism. We make them happy with whatever it takes to make them happy, as Alter Rebbe says. You give them nuts, you give them candy, you give them whatever it is to make them happy. But the true objective over here is for our neshama. It's all about the festival of the neshama, for us to return to God, for us to experience a true relationship with Hashem once again. So with that in mind, getting on all fours and scrubbing the floor over the next 3 weeks and getting ready of all the festivities and everything, maybe those $2,000 will become a little more, with a little more festivities with it, when we understand what it means when we are besimcha, when we are joyous on holidays. With that being said, I'm going to go clean the bath. Okay. Thank you all for joining. And starting next week, Holy Cup. We will beginning talking about the different things, the significance of the 4 cups. The week after that, that's the next two Thursdays, talking about the 4 cups. The week after that, we're talking about the sandwich, the significance of the signature sandwich. And then just 3 days later, on Monday, which is the week of Passover, we'll be talking about provoking proverbial questions. Say that fast 10 times. L'chaim to Shmuel David for sponsoring tonight's class. L'chaim to Yaakov Reichlin, who doesn't even realize it, but he donated that bottle of water. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for watching.